There are complex political issues that are oversimplified to hide bad policy. And then there are simple economic issues that are made more complicated in order to hide bad policy. Tax cuts are one that we have a really good grasp of, right? Assuming that you're in a mixed capitalist economy, when there's a pseudo free market, basically, if things are like things are in the United States, when you give poor and middle income people a tax cut or a tax credit, they mostly spend the money because they need the money. They're sort of short on money, so they need the money and they're going to spend that money. If you go to rich people and you give them a tax cut, they disproportionately save the money because their needs are met, right? If you're used to going to expensive restaurants, you're not likely to go to many more of them because you get a tax cut, for example. And if you give big corporations a tax cut, they will not use the money to hire people, all else being equal. Companies hire workers when there's demand for their product or service. After the Trump corporate tax cuts, we heard anecdotes about this company is giving raises, that one is hiring more people, but they were just anecdotes, and that's why we call it merely anecdotal evidence or data. We heard a couple dozen stories about that. We now have broader data from the last year from S&P 500 companies, and the S&P 500 is, it's an index. It includes 500 large publicly traded companies. It's a broader index than the Dow. It's a more diversified index than the NASDAQ, which is very tech heavy. And those 500 companies that are part of the S&P 500 overwhelmingly spent their tax cuts on buying back stock, which increases the value of that stock and helps the executives and the rich people. And they spent that money on dividends, which also disproportionately helps their executives and rich people. And if you know anything about basic finance and economics, you say, of course they did that. Of course they did that. This is such a simple thing. If you think about a tax rate as a cost, ask yourself the question, would you rather avoid a high cost or a low cost? A tax rate is the sort of opposite of an interest rate that you make on money that you have in the bank, right? If you can choose between earning, let's go with Pat. Let's see if even Pat gets this. And I know, I don't mean that to be dismissive. I mean, just let's see if Pat understands what we're talking about here. If you can choose, Pat, between earning 2% interest or 4% interest on your money, which would you choose?
I'll go with the 4% interest.
Why?
It's twice as much.
You make more money,
yes.
Right? If you can choose, Pat, between avoiding a 2% tax or avoiding a 4% tax, which would you choose?
I'd like to avoid the 4% tax.
And why is that?
It'll save me money.
That's exactly right. When the tax rate goes down, you are less incentivized to avoid the tax by investing in your company because those investments are tax deductible. When the tax rate goes up, you're more incentivized to do things with the money that will help you avoid the tax. And this came up during my interview with Dave Rubin, if you remember, Pat, like a year or a year and a half ago. It was a moment of significant confusion that a lot of people pointed out. The only thing here that's surprising is that the Trump administration tried to say companies would use the money for hiring when it was obviously untrue, and people bought it because a basic understanding of economics tells you if you lower the tax rate on corporations, it encourages profit taking and it encourages just buying up stock to drive the price up.
It was obvious all along, and shortly after the Trump tax cuts were implemented, we did a story about how Morgan Stanley, how they put that extra money. And I guess the plurality of what they put that extra money into were things like stock buybacks and dividends, whereas only like 10, 15% went to raises and bonuses and the things that we were promised and would like to see happen.
Well, that ratio of like roughly 90-10 or 85-15, that's the ratio that the data more broadly is pointing to, which is that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the tax cuts to these big corporations have been used to pay bigger dividends to shareholders and executives and also to buy back stock. And last year, we had another report from the Institute for Policy Studies, which showed that when you do a corporate tax cut, it boosts CEO and executive pay, but you don't typically see an increase in jobs nor in the wages for the average worker. It's a really simple economic concept that people who want corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the rich will pretend is really complex in order to get people on board with it. It's just bad policy, plain and simple, and there is nothing surprising about this except for the fact that people keep falling for these obvious lies. Discuss this with us on our subreddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Today's program is sponsored in part by Blinkist.com/Pakman. If you've not already heard about Blinkist, it's amazing. It's an app for your phone, tablet, or web browser. And what they do is they take nonfiction books, popular nonfiction, critically acclaimed nonfiction. They condense the book into a 15-minute audiobook. You get all the most important information and insights from each book, but you can soak up the entire essence of the book in one sitting. I've listened to a ton of books on Blinkist. One recent one is Robert Reich's new book, The Common Good. Also Bunk by Kevin Young, useful in preparing me for the pseudoscience miniseries that we're producing. And if you are a David Pakman Show viewer or listener, you can get a 7-day free trial by going to Blinkist.com/Pakman. If you're watching on YouTube, use the link in the video description. After the free trial, if you like it, you can get the full access to thousands of condensed audiobooks for about $5 a month. That's BLINKIST.com/PAKMAN.